Good morning. We are on Ayin Beis, volume 3, the top of page 1217. Okay. So in the continuing discussion of Ani Rishon v'Ani Achren, the process of creation from Keser to Malchus, and then Malchus creating the next stage called Biya, Bri Yitzir Asiyah. So the Rebbe Rashab first spoke in general terms, Keser, Chachma, the 10 spheres, and then Malchus. And now we speak about in Malchus itself, you also have the 10 spheres, starting from Keser Malchus, which is the awakening and being aware of the transcendent and exalted state, Hisnaasus Atzmi, and the revealed desire to be a melech, to be in that state of being of kingship, or you can say the state of transcendence, which is the cause that leads to actually ruling and governing and becoming a king over the people, which in context of God is also includes the power, the actual creation of existence. So these are the stages in the process of how it comes from a state that's beyond, it becomes revealed, then a desire, and then actualization. And the actualization is where the creation process happens, Malchus, the creative power. And as a result of that, so Keser Malchus is the first two stages, the revealing of that Hisnaasus Atzmi, of that exalted, that transcendent state. Atik, Arich, the lower level of Keser is the Ratzon for it, the desire. Then comes the rest of the steps, all the way to Malchus of Malchus. He doesn't spell out the other spheres, but we could extrapolate from what we learned earlier. We can apply that here as well. That is the development of the design, the details, through Chachma, Bina, the shape and design, all the way through the Midas, until it gets to Malchus of Malchus, which, as he said at the big bottom of page 1216, that Malchus will become Keser of Biya. And he said that's the general Koyach HaPoel, the general creation, like basically the Koyach HaPoel HaKloli that I discussed earlier, yesterday, that the Koyach HaPoel, the general power to create, which is still makif like a melech, but that melech then extends into the details, Yisavas B'Poel, by the Oisius and the Tzirufim of Vayhi Oyer, Vayemer Elokim Yehi Oyer, Vayemer Elokim Yehi Rakia. In the example of a king, it would be he's not just king, but he's also now governing by sending his emissaries and his ambassadors to different parts of the nation to be mayors and governors, or to fulfill different particular functions, but they are applying themselves and being mislabish themselves in clothing themselves in each a part of that empire. In the context of creation, that's the Koyach HaPoel that goes b'bchinas kiruv, where God is actually creating each specific detail. But the details go back to the Koyach Klali, which is still makif, that the general creation, that goes back to the levels of Keser Malchus, which is the earlier stages of where this all began in the whole process. Like we also learned that something that's in the Atzmi level doesn't mean it's going to be revealed. It could remain in a dormant state. So the goal is to reveal it, to come into a desire. The desire in turn informs a design and details, ultimately leading to being Melech B'Poel in general and in specifics. So that's a process all the way from preconception to the actual final implementation. And ultimately that's going to be the Ani Rishon and Ani Achren that will soon explain, he'll soon spell that out. So you have here really a model also for all process. Everything that you and I, the human beings, create that's worth talking about goes through these steps. Before it begins is like it's still in a dormant state and it's not revealed. And then it could be anything, building a business, building a home, building a family. Anything that you want to create needs to go through all these steps for it to be effective and healthy and sustainable. It needs to go all the way down to the details, because you can have all this in theory, and you could have it all in a very abstract way. You need to implement it in actual detail. So Malchus has to become Keser of Biya. But on the other hand, you need to have the early stages, because without that, the rest won't flow. So you need to first have a sense of this, I call it transcendent sense of what it is that begins the process. That in turn becomes a desire. The desire will turn into a plan and a design. Chochmah, the nekuda, bina, the shape and details, all the way Malchus and Malchus that implements in general terms and then in specific terms. So if you think of it that way, it might be something far more relatable and palpable that we can relate to and understand in our own personal lives. Now, the next section, that's set. Now, the next section we learned, first of all, maybe stop here if anybody has any questions on this, because this sums up pretty much what we've been learning the last few pages. And the next step is going to be about the parsa, which we began learning, but I'm going to review it now. So I want to stop if anybody wants any clarification for anything. No? Okay, good. So now on line 2 on page 1217, the Rebbe Rashab he goes back to the parsa. Because it's not just enough to go through all these stages. You also need a diminishment, and you need in this case, a partition or a curtain. So let me use an example. Why is that necessary? Why is what I just said till now seems perfectly fine? It goes from Hisnaasus Atzmi, revealed, a rotzen, a desire for melucha. Then that begins to become detail-oriented with the shape and form of reishis, of Chochmah and Bina, Malchus of Malchus, until it gets into details by Yemer Lekimi, he the Oasis and Serufi, of the specific details. However, the thing is, because there's such an infinite distance from the creator and the creation, or in this case, the Mashpia and the Makabel. So if it was talking about purely on a very human level, you could argue maybe you don't need a parsa, but as you'll see in a moment, even there you need one. So the parsa comes to account for, to help move this along through the paradigm shifts that may be needed. So the classic example of a parsa is like a moshel. Partition curtain is like a moshel, an example that a teacher uses to explain something to a student that can't understand it without the example. So sometimes you can understand something when the student and teacher are more or less commensurate to each other. You may not need an example because the idea is understood. But sometimes when it's an idea that's too abstract or too profound or new and fresh to the student, the teacher will use an example. Now, example will always be a foreign entity. It won't be an example from the subject itself. Like if you want to explain Ayin Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum with an example, it can't be an example that talks that is about Ayin Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. You need an example that relates to you or me. That I would say, with that example, I can understand. Go back to that initial concept. So example is always going to be a so-called foreign example, meaning a dover zar. That's the expression in Chassidus. Something that's not made of the same fabric what the example is coming to teach. Let's even use here in the Maimer itself. How did he begin to explain Malchus? Malchus de Rakia, the kingship in heaven. He said, Al derech moshel, hamelech, the king below, the coronation, you crown him, and you stimulate the desire to be king. Why do you need the moshel? Because for us to understand what's going up in the higher levels is not completely tangible. So the more you can find something within your life, an example, the better it is. So that example in Chassidus is called a parsa. Its purpose is to reveal, but its function is a concealer. That's why it serves as a good example. So when you come to a child and you say to a child, look, the custom that Jews are that when you start teaching a child Aleph Beis, you teach it to them, and some grandmothers and mothers would put honey and sugar on the piece of whatever, the paper or the plastic or where you teach them Aleph Beis, so they should feel the sweetness of Torah. Now we all know the sweetness of Torah is a spiritual sweetness, not a physical sweetness, not like eating sugar. But for a child, he doesn't yet know what spiritual sweetness you want him to associate. So you want to do something that stimulates his senses in a sweet way, in a way that's attractive. So then you plant in his mind that sweetness is associated with something that is Torah. So the moshel is not just a moshel; it's actually the same sweetness, but it just manifests itself in a garment that a child can relate to. The Rebbe has a very very powerful sikha. He talks about, well, it starts with the story that when the Frierdiker Rebbe, before Pesach, they were cleaning out the Frierdiker Rebbe as a child, his pockets, and they found candies, which of course were chametz, were not Pesach. And they asked him, what are these candies? So he said, these are the candies when you led me into cheder, there's the Ayin. It's a custom that when you take a child into the first time to the school, you cover him in a talis and you throw candies. And you say, Malach Machol is throwing these candies. So he said, when I heard Malach Machol throwing these candies, I'm not going to eat them and I'm not going to throw them out. So I kept them in my pockets, Malach Machol's candies, the angel Machol's candies. Okay, so the Rebbe continues and said, very beautiful. But here's one issue here. The whole point of chinuch is to teach a child truth. Did the Malach Machol actually throw these candies? We know the parents threw the candies. So how can you teach a child something that's not completely true? Fine, with good intentions. The child will grow up become a little older and say, what's second? Malach Machol threw the candies? I'm throwing the candies to my children. And the Rebbe's answer is so simple, but also so profound. He says, where does sweetness and candies come from in the first place? They didn't create themselves. God created spiritual sweetness, chesed of Atzilus. That chesed of Atzilus became chesed of Biya. Malach Machol is chesed of Biya. He is the actual spiritual root, the spiritual archetype of sweetness. However, a child may not understand that. So the parents serve as shluchim of Malach Machol. The candies manifest in this physical world the sweetness of the ruchnius of chesed of Biya, which roots in higher levels and higher levels. So that you're absolutely telling the child the truth. It is Malach Machol throwing the candies, except the way Malach Machol, it's on a spiritual state. So the point being is that a moshel, on one hand, is like a parsa, because at the end of the day, a physical candy is not a spiritual chesed, even though its very soul is that. So parsa is necessary because when you want to move from the paradigm of Atzilus, which is completely elikus. Yes, elikus that's applying itself to create. Remember, Atzilus is the interface, as we learned on page 1215. Atzilus mamutza ben erein sof hamaitzel el hanivroim. That's what Atzilus is. So, but at the same time, Atzilus itself is also, even though it has structure, which is why it serves as an interface, but it's a divine structure. Everything in Atzilus is elikus. It's like Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov. They're 24/7 divine channels. So yes, these channels are now being harnessed and directed toward creation from Keser Malchus through all the levels to Malchus of Malchus. But now you have to move into the world that you need Nivroim. You need an actual Nivra now. Not just God envisioning or God relating to creation, but an actual creation. So even though Hashem says Yehi Oyer, and that gives shape and form to the Oyer that will be created, but we need physical light. So from the spiritual to the physical, you need to have a parsa. So the parsa accounts for this shift, this paradigm shift from spiritual to physical. The levels before shape the Oyer to fit into this keli, but the parsa actually gives it a certain tangibility that becomes an actual creation. So you could say, one second, so why do we need the Yehi Oyer? If God anyway needs a parsa to create, so what do you need all these levels for? The answer is obvious. It would be like asking, what do you need Malach Machol for? Give the child the candies and say it comes from God. Because the point is that you want the Ruchnius to fit into the Gashmius. It's not just we're moving from a paradigm shift, a jump from God to creation. You want to have all these stages because that's how you grow. Because as the child will grow, they'll learn, okay, one second, physical sweetness comes from spiritual sweetness. Chesed of Asiyah, Chesed of Yitzirah, Chesed of Biya. So you want to also have that whole, like we said, stepping stones. You need the ladder. So therefore you need a combination of the Oyer being mitzumtzum all the way into Malchus of Malchus, applying itself to the Melucha, Makif, Koyach Kloli, Koyach Prati, Yehi Oyer, Yehi Rakia, or in our case, the actual instructions or the details of anything that you're interacting with, But the parsa creates the shift, creates that like the curtain that somewhat diminishes the intensity of the light of the sun of Atzilus. So now you can have an actual creation in the context of Biya. So with that, I'm going to read again from the second line, the top of the page. So he says like this: when now Malchus is moving to Kesel Lebriya, he says, Zehu la'achar ha'parsa sheben Atzilus lebriya. That comes after the parsa. So it's not just that Malchus becomes Kesel Lebriya and there's no shift. There's a shift. The Kesel Lebriya comes, there's a partition in between. So Malchus of Malchus, as it is in Atzilus, and Malchus that becomes Kesel Lebriya, the parsa is in between that accounts for the shift that we're talking about. However, as I said briefly mentioned yesterday, the Rebbe Rashab is going to explain that they're interdependent. That Malchus of Malchus being a koyach nivdal, as we learned in the previous pages, actually is very fitting to work with the parsa. It actually creates that parsa. So let me explain that with a moshel, then we'll learn it inside. When the teacher now finds an example to explain to a student or a child a profound concept that the student and child cannot understand without the example, there's more than just an example going on here. The teacher is also taking the idea and tailoring it to the example. So in addition to the actual example that's being used, the idea itself has now been shaped to work with this example. In other words, when we talk, let's say, about Malach Machal being the originator, the archetype of sweetness, on its pure level, that's a whole concept you can learn about in Chassidus at length. What's Malach Machal and what is Chesed, etc., and how it connects to higher levels. But if you want to explain to somebody who doesn't know all that, you have to take the idea of Malach Machal and fit it and say, okay, now Malach Machal becomes the root of that will evolve from level to level till we have physical sweetness in this world. You have sugar. You put in your mouth, you feel sweet, or a sweet personality. So what you're doing is not only are you providing an example, you're also making sure the idea that you're explaining fits the example. So in other words, it's not just that the parsa, because the parsa, let's say with chachma, with reshis, or with keser, would not be enough. You need the energy of Atzilus to go level by level into detail, all the way to Malchus of Malchus, and Dafka Malchus, which remains removed on one hand, but it also applies itself like in detail and becomes the Keser of Bria. That entity itself, which is a diminished state. As we said, Malchus does not reveal much about the source. In this case, the teacher. The idea, as it's right now going to be expressed to the student, originates from the teacher, and it's definitely coming from the teacher, but it reveals much less of the brilliance of the teacher than, let's say, Midas. Remember, we talked about Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Midas, and Meichin are actually channels that reveal the soul. Malchus, he called it a koyach nivdal, which means because it doesn't reveal as much, and its relationship with another is also not in a close way. A king and his people are not close, they're not friends. Chesed, when you have love to someone, that's a closeness. You love each other. It's a certain equality going on. With a melech, there's a state of remove. That's what we discussed. So he's explaining now, he's going to explain how that Malchus is perfect, because Malchus actually removes the idea, diminishes the idea to the point that it can fit into the parsa. And in that sense, Malchus is the Helam of Malchus, is actually the source that actually creates this parsa. So the ability for the teacher to find a good example is also his ability to diminish the intensity of his idea. That's why you'll find teachers who are brilliant, but they can't explain it with examples to someone else because they can't get it down to that level. They're just their glow and the shine of their intensity of their idea is so dominant. You know, like you see these absent-minded professors or teachers who just go on, and you say to them, can you just stop a moment and explain this? And they're unable to do so because there's so much in that level, like without a parsa, without a tzimtzum. So they can't take their seichel and channel it, and therefore they can't find an example. For a teacher to do that requires restraint and discipline, and it's an art. It doesn't come easy, because the smarter the teacher, the harder it is to bring it down to that level. Now, Shlomo HaMelech was known for, he was able to give 3,000 examples for any idea. Chassidus says not just 3,000 examples for the same idea, but an example for an example for an example. That means he was able to bring it down 3,000 paradigms, 3,000 levels. And that is requires a far deeper understanding, because as we know, those that can give an example like that means that they have a better understanding of it. Even though initially it seems like the one that can't give an example is more brilliant, but the truth is it requires more brilliance to be able to contain it and channel it. So Malchus is that entity that does that. So in a sense, Malchus's nature of bittul, les lo megarma klum, that has nothing of its own, like the moon. The moon, its diminishment, and the moon diminished itself, like we learned earlier. It was the Eibishter said, "Go be diminished." The moon's bittul ends up becoming something that reveals much more than the sun does, as we discussed in Ayin. Not going there right now, but I just wanted to apply it to here. So Malchus, on one hand, is the lowest of the spheres. On the other hand, because it suspends and essentially strips itself of any identity, it becomes the perfect channel to draw down all the energies from the higher levels. It becomes a perfect channel to allow room for a student, in this case, Biya, a creation, to emerge. And it allows for the ability to communicate to that makabel, because it is in a state of concealment, but at the same time transmitting. And it's in a state that allows for an example to be created, the parsa that he's explaining here. Now, a lot of what I just said does not say explicitly here. And so it's coming from number one in volume 1 in Ayin Beis and volume 2 as well, where this was discussed. And in general, when you really come to understand the concept, you come to relate to it. I'll just say one more thing and then we'll learn it inside. And then I'll stop for any questions. When God, we know, is a very powerful state. It's divine consciousness. Bligvul, Ein Sof. However, one thing it's lacking. It does not reveal the etzem mamish. Where's the etzem revealed? Remember, we learned the beginning of volume 3. Ein oid is not giluyim. It's the very power to conceal comes from the deepest part, because it takes much more energy to conceal than to reveal. For God to reveal, it seems like natural, quote unquote, natural. Nothing is natural because God does not need to reveal. But the revelation is an expression of the divine. For God to withhold that and restrain it, and in a sense, it should recede. The koyach hatzimtzum reveals a power, an koyach atzmi, that's not revealed in Giluyim. Like in simple terms, for if you have something to say, if you're a wise person and you have something to say, is it easier to speak or is it easier to remain silent? Of course it's easier to speak, because you have what to say. But you exercise restraint for whatever reason you feel you shouldn't be saying anything right now. That takes much more energy and much more effort. So it comes from a deeper place. So Malchus, in this paradoxical way, which is essentially connecting to the parsa, like we said, actually comes from a deeper place, because just like the teacher who can give an example, it requires a deeper type of understanding. If you can explain something to someone that's not like you, that doesn't have your background and your knowledge, it means you understand it better. So basically, that's one thing I wanted to add, that Tzimtzum itself and Parsa itself, like Malchus, really is rooted in a very deep place. Even though, technically speaking, it's limiting the light and diminishing it, and then concealing it to some extent, but that concealment comes from a very profound place. We learn, and we will learn how that is Ein Oid. That Ein Oid means the power of that very Elikim itself, not Havayo Elikim, but Elikim itself. Okay. That the night itself will shine. So let me read a few lines before the parentheses, and then I'll stop in case, because I said a lot here, and maybe you want more clarification or have any questions. So now he says, V'hine mashanasa keser lebriya. I'm repeating, it's line 3. When Malchus becomes keser lebriya, in other words, it's moving, shifting now to the world of Briya, no longer in Atzilus. Zeu la'achar ha'pasha sheben Atzilus lebriya. That comes after the partition, or the curtain between Atzilus and Briya. V'hainu dafke la'achar hisalmus ha'oyer. Oz dafke efshaliyas b'bchinas keser lebriya. It's only after the concealment of the oyer that comes in the parsa's concealment, like a shade, like a curtain, that then Malchus can go to the level of Kesser Lebriya through piercing. In other words, the light is now coming and shining through the curtain. So there's a light, but the light has been shifted by the parson. But then he goes, and the next piece is what I just explained at length. V'yadua. Just a second. Yeah, v'yadua, and it's known. The Hisnaasus, zehu gufa hu aidei Hisnaasus the b'chinas Malchus. So now he's adding. It's not just an additional component of parsa. That the concealment, that gufa, that itself comes through Malchus's so-called distance, if you wish, or exaltedness, or transcendence. So Malchus is conducive, the Hisnaasus comes from that. Like the Melech does not reveal himself to his nation. They don't know who he really is. The Ayin Hisnaasus hu b'chinas havdalah v'Hisnaasus, because Hisnaasus is a state of remove, being above and beyond. So havdalah. Havdalah means like separate, but separate as in beyond, and Hisnaasus, and concealed. Again, concealment here meaning because of it's of a different quality. Like we learned yesterday. So I'm just going to skip the parentheses for a moment because I just want to finish this idea, and we're going to go back to the parentheses. But let me just finish. If you go around, the parentheses is 7-8 lines. So after the parentheses, on the line that begins the Gadlus, he says the Vahainu, the b'chinas Hisnaasus Atzmi, the b'chinas Kesser Malchus. That means the Hisnaasus Atzmi of Kesser Malchus, which is, we said the whole process began. At first, the very transcendent, exalted state was revealed. Kesser Malchus. Ayidei zeh dafka nasa b'chinas hatzimtzum v'harichuk sheyuchel liyas habriya ma'ayin liyesh mib'chinas Malchus shabamalchus. So in other words, it's this the very fact that this state of concealment that can create comes from this Hisnaasus Atzmi. So the highest levels are revealed, that from that level is revealed through that can be the tzimtzum that I just explained, that powerful concealment and distance that allows for the Biya to be created in Biya, the Elam HaBriya. So if you started from Chachma or from Bina, you wouldn't have that power to be able to all the way bring it into another paradigm called Biya, the example that as I explained, the example of the teacher. So that's what allows it to come down all the way to Malchus Shaba Malchus. Okay, actually I should stop right before that. But bottom line is, you see here now how the beginning is wedged in the end, and the end in the beginning, the Ani Rishon, Ani Achrin, how Malchus is now operating as a force of creation as it moves into Biya. And that's rooted in the highest levels of Kesser Malchus. So Kesser Malchus and Malchus Sheba Malchus that become Kesser Biya are connected in that sense. So I just wanted to read those few lines, which we'll go over again when we learn it after the parentheses. But let me stop and pause here. If anybody wants any clarification or questions, please. Okay. I guess so now we're going to do the parentheses that is going to analyze a bit more this concept based on the Likutei Torah that the Rebbe Rashab just cited. So the parentheses begins v'hamuvan sham. Now when you look into that mimer in the Biya, the explanation of Mimona in Likutei Torah, it says hamuvan sham, and what's understood there, when you learn that mimer, this is what's understood. The kavana al b'chinas Malchus, kamoi shehi ba'Atzilus, kamoi shehi ba'Atzilus b'chinas Hisnaasus Atzmi. That this level of Malchus that we're talking, that is remains in a state of Havdalah and Hisnaasus, he says from the Likutei Torah, it's understood that it's referring to Malchus in Atzilus that's in the state of Hisnaasus Atzmi. In other words, it could have been Hisnaasus Ala'am. Remember, there's two levels of Hisnaasus. Hisnaasus could be the very sense that you feel exalted and transcendent, even if there's no one around. In other words, not in comparison and not in relation to another, just a sense of specialness, like you could have, like we spoke earlier about the human being. On bottom of page 1214, he said, "Adam yeshlei teva hamemshala." Someone that's a leader does not need to be leading to be a leader. A sense of leadership is there in your heart and soul. Like the king in his inner sanctum. He doesn't necessarily need the nation to be applauding him or honoring or celebrating him. But then there's Hisnaasus ala am. That's when the melucha is actualized. B'reiv am haders melech. That with a great many people is the glory of the king, the beauty of the king. And it's dafke reiv am. So in other words, if the king comes out and no one is there, it's not respectful. And it's actually a din in halacha even. There's dinim that discuss, for example, a bris. So there's a discussion, is it better to make a bris early in your Mekayim zriz and magdim mitzvahs, that as soon as the 8th day begins, there's the bris like zrizus, quickly? Or what happens if more people will show up at the bris later in the afternoon or later in the day? So you could say, B'reiv am hadus melech is trumps zriz magdim mitzvahs. So in the case of bris, it's not the case that way. The zrizus is more important than the reiv am. But there are halachas and dinim where having more people is more covered for the obviously for the Bala Bris, but also covered for Hashem's mitzvah, that if you could do something later and you have more people, that takes precedent over doing something earlier and you have less people. So there are clear dinim where having more people is more respectful. But that's the melech as Hisnaasus ala am, not Hisnaasus Atzmi. Because even when you do the bris, let's say in the morning, it's not like God is not there. There, the zrizus is his honor. The fact that you're doing it quickly means you want to do it in a way that's immediately, as soon as you can be Mekayim HaMitzvah, Mekayim HaMitzvah. So there's two different aspects of Hisnaasus. So the Rebbe Rashab saying it's understood from the Kutei Torah that the Malchus that we're talking about, that is Muvdal and Nelam and the Salmus, is the level of Hisnaasus Atzmi that goes all the way up to Keser, to the highest levels. That can even be in a state, first is in a state that's dormant and then gets revealed. So the Rebbe Rashab is going to ask a question. If that's the case, he says like this, so let me explain. Hisnaasus Atzmi, by definition, is not about Oyer. Oyer is already revelation. Revelation is already a manifestation. So you could say it's already relating to something. It's real Hisnaasus Atzmi is the thing that's not connected to revelation. So if it's a state of Atzmi, we know Atzmi is not subject to revelation nor to concealment. When the Melech is in his own state, where he feels an exalted state, it's not Atzmi. It's not subject to Eir or Gilead and Helam. Once it's revealed, you could say it could be revealed, it could be concealed. So from the Kutei Torah, it seems that the state of Malchus is Hisnaasus Atzmi. But Atzmi is not subject to Helam. So why are you saying that Malchus is in a state of Hisalmus, of concealment? We're talking about something that's beyond concealment and beyond revelation. And Atzmi is the thing. Now, this is more significant than it sounds. It's not just a technical question, which level is it? This comes down to put it in more blatant terms, is this. The question is God's Hisnaasus Atzmi and his Atzmi's Dika level ever going to be experienced by us, the Am, or we can only relate to the Giluyim of Elokus? So remember, we discussed this at length. This is very much part of Avayu Elikim and Einei. Can we relate only to Atzmus as Atzmus expresses himself in a revealed way, or can we relate to the Etzem itself? Now, I should qualify. This is like a thing I need my own clarification. It's not so clear to me, because the seemingly Hisnaasus Atzmi is also not purely Atzmus. Atzmus doesn't need Hisnaasus Atzmi either. It's completely beyond that too. But I'm assuming what he means here is just the fact that Atzmus is of a different reality. So it's not so much that Atzmus needs it or feels it. Remember, Hisnaasus Atzmi can be in a state, like I explained the other day, not that it's concealed, from God because nothing is concealed. But it's above concealment and revelation. It's above awareness, above consciousness. God is God, period. There doesn't have to be, say, God feels himself, knows himself, is aware of himself. Those are all words that are created words, basically, in order to create an existence. In God, within his own God's essence, there's no expression altogether, no need for expression. So Hisnaasus Atzmi, it seems to me here, is referring to that level. So it's fundamentally beyond everything. It's like saying Atzmus is built to Metzias Nimtza. Nothing is like him. So it's not because God is greater than creation. That's already a comparison. That we're the subjects, and God's our king. That's already a relationship. We're talking here about the essential superior quality of God's very reality. So if that's the case, so why does it seem like in Likutei Torah, not seem? He says muva misham. Doesn't say mashma misham. Mashma. He says move on. That is talking about Malchus, the way it's connected between Hisnaasus Atzmi, and l'cheira Hisnaasus Atzmi is only in the domain of etzem, not in the domain of gilui, of oir, and therefore, why do you relate it to Isalmus? There's no Isalmus here. The fact that Atzmus is not felt by us is not because Atzmus is concealed, it's because Atzmus is beyond concealment and revelation. It's a very important point. The Tzimtzum did not affect Atzmus, because Atzmus is not Gilui and not Hela. Atzmus can be here and not be here in our consciousness, not because he's concealed, because he's fundamentally beyond states of concealment and revelation. Then there's Oir Ein Sof, where God created a revelation and awareness, and that awareness he concealed that we should not be aware of that Oir. But that Oir is potentially something we could be aware of. When it comes to Atzmus, the word is not awareness. The word is just an experience. It is what it is. So in that context, he's asking here, so Hisnaasus Atzmi doesn't relate to the words of Gilui and Helam. Malchus does, because Malchus is subject to a concealment, like we're saying, in comparison to the other faculties. So that's his so-called, he says it doesn't ask ach koshi, it doesn't say difficult, he says l'cheira, which means seeming. No, it's a question, but not, there are different levels of how questions are asked. You know, we've seen where the Rebbe Rashab says, tzarich lahavin, we have to understand. Or kosher, it's difficult. Here he's using the word l'cheira, just a milder form of, it's more like a qualification. But bottom line is we still need the explanation. So im kein harizela mailam b'chinas Isalmus, rak mashahu b'chinas Isalmus ba'atzmei loy lahaylim dover. Let me explain. I explained what this means, but let me explain the actual words. In volume 2, he explained this idea in the beginning of when he started speaking about tzimtzumim and parsois. He said there's two ways to conceal something. One is, let's say the sunlight is shining. It's very bright, and it blinds your eyes, the glare. So you put on shades. The shades are concealing the light, so you can now look at the sun, or you can be outside in daylight and not have to squint and not be in any way blinded or hurt by the intensity of the sunlight. That's a simple way of understanding a helam. That's a helam. But that's what he calls lahaylim dover. You're concealing something. What are you concealing? A light that's shining brightly, and you're concealing it. You know, another example would be, I have something in my hand, a precious object, and I close my hand and I say, guess what it is? So I'm concealing something. Or it's inside of a treasure chest. It's concealed. But then there's another form of concealment, what he calls here, Hisalmus ba'atzmei, which means he's not using some object to conceal. He's fundamentally just concealing himself, like by just not extending himself. You're not using something to conceal. When you talk about the tzimtzum can be understood in two ways. One is that you're using something to conceal the light, like in the case of a parsa that we learned. Another way is that you just don't speak. Like the teacher, he's not concealing his idea in an example. He's just not speaking. He's not expressing himself. So that's a Hisnaasus ba'atzmi. That's a different type of concealment. So in other words, what he's saying is that the Atzmi is in the first state of concealment. L'mayla b'chinas Hisnaasus. He's not in the second state of concealment. Malchus is the second state because Malchus conceals energy. The parsa is part of that concealment. That's an entity that's concealing. When you talk about Hisnaasus Atzmi, there's no such concealment. There's no entity that's concealing anything. Any concealment is all within God's own choice, so to speak, in that sense. So based on that, the question remains, so which one is it? From the Kuta Teira, it seems like Malchus Hisnaasus Atzmi, Hisnaasus ba'atzmi, and from the mere fact that we're talking about Malchus as with a parsa, sounds like a Hisnaasus through a dover, that you're actually concealing something, and it's not, in that sense, it's not Hisnaasus Atzmi. So the Rebbe Rashab answers, Yesh lemer, the bebchinas Malchus liyish zewa is galus Hisnaasus Atzmi kanal. That since Malchus is the revelation of Hisnaasus Atzmi, that highest level of Hisnaasus, not just as the Melech relates to the nation, but also the fundamental exalted and transcendent state of Atzmi, of the Atzmi, of Hisnaasus Atzmi. So Shaykh B'zeh Hisnaasus Shemaylim. So that's why it's possible that Malchus should have the power to conceal. So let me explain what I think this means. It's very brief, and he's going to say Gam Yashlemer, another answer. So let's first understand the first answer. First, I thought that he was going to say, let me just give you my thought process. But I think this, initially I thought that he was going to say that the Malchus has two things. One thing is that it has the power to conceal, like we just said with the parsa, another force that conceals. Another is that Malchus also has the first element, the higher element, that it just, within itself, it gets concealed because it's in that level of Hisnaasus Atzmi. That's what I first thought. But then when I read it again, it sounds that because it's rooted in Hisnaasus Atzmi, which is higher than concealment and revelation, and the concealment is only within itself, not through another thing, that's why Malchus has is Shaykh B'zeh Hisnaasus Shemaylim, which means not Hisnaasus ba'atzmi. That's why Malchus has the ability to put in the example of the teacher. That's why the teacher, because the teacher's brilliance is rooted in such a core place, that's why he has the ability to actually develop an example, an outside force that will conceal the idea as it's conveyed to the student. The truth is, as I think about it, it's not really a contradiction to what I said just a moment before. Maybe that is what he's saying, that there's two parts to it. Malchus, as it's rooted in that deeper place, and then that's why Malchus has the ability to actually conceal like a parsa. Now, this needs a lot more explanation. Yes, and I'll explain it, but I just wanted to first get the pshat on, express that. I want to read the Gam Yashlemer because I'm sure it's connected, and then I will either explain some more or maybe get your questions, because I'm sure some of you would like to get more clarity on this.
It's a contradiction.
Maybe I explained it enough.
It's a contradiction what he says, Simon.
Well, hold on. I just said that. Let me finish, and then I'll take questions. One second. Gam Yashlemer. We can also say Shamaylim ala keches sheina edus v'agiluyim shemisalmin ba'etzem. That Malchus conceals the faculties which are the edus and the giluyim that are concealed in the etzem. Let me finish reading. Like it says elsewhere, that the nature of intelligence, of intellect, of mature intellect, a high level of intellect, is the capacity to restrain and refrain himself, because you're in a state that's completely removed. In other words, the fact that a person has moichin the gadlus means they have a very powerful mind, and which means they're removed from other individuals who don't have that powerful mind. And as a result of that, that's why that person has the capacity to restrain himself. So in other words, the power to restrain comes from the state of being a higher, fundamentally higher state. Now, how is this different than the first explanation is a good question, but I wanted to read it, and then let me just tell you my thought on this, and then we can hear what you have to say. So clearly he's talking about two different ways, as I said, of being concealed. One is a concealment that's related to revelation. It's either revealed or you cover up. That's the lower level. Then there's a concealment that has nothing to do with covering up something. It's just fundamentally you're removed from it all. And if you choose not to express yourself, that's called helam. So it's a helam ba'atzmi, that he calls it. Hisnaasus ba'atzmi. The question is Malchus. From the Maimer and Kutei Torah, it seems like Malchus is Hisnaasus Atzmi. But from the fact that there's a Hisnaasus that Malchus gets covered up as it goes into Biya, into Kesed de Biya, traveling through the Parsa. And the very Parsa is all part of this Malchus Havdalah. So is Malchus Havdalah Atzmis? Or is it Havdalah that is relative, meaning it's concealing itself from something else? So from the first Yesh Shleimer, so he's saying that, maybe that's the difference between my first thought and the second thought. He's saying because it's revealing, it's the revelation of Hisnaasus Atzmi, that's why, oh, you know what? I'm going to correct myself. I think the answer is different than what I said. I think the answer I said, I think, is the second answer. Now, when I read it again, I have a different way of reading it. The focus is on the word Hisgalus Hisnaasus. Remember, he said Hisnaasus Atzmi is Atzmus loy b'chinas oyer. That's fine. But Malchus is the revelation of that Hisnaasus Atzmi. Remember, Keser Malchus is not just the Hisnaasus of Atzmus, Hisnaasus Atzmi, it's revealing that he's aware of it. Remember, Keser Malchus is the revelation. It could have remained dormant and concealed. Concealed meaning fundamentally concealed. So since Malchus, which extends from Keser Malchus, is Hisgalus of Hisnaasus Atzmi, that's why now you have a Gili. So basically, Malchus is the etzem as it comes begili. So now once it's begili, shaykh b'zeh helam. Remember, we said helam is not shaykh in a place that's higher than gili. But since Malchus is the gili Hisnaasus Atzmi, yeah, that's the pshat, because the word shaykh was bothering me. Now shaykh b'zeh salma shamaylim. So now it's shaykh, there should be a helam, because you've already, so to speak, expressed that Hisnaasus Atzmi. Now, of course, you could ask the question, so what happens with this Hisnaasus Atzmi that's fundamentally removed from it all? So that's a good question. But remember, at the end of the day, Malchus is not Atzmus. There's only one God. Atzmus is Atzmus. Atzmus can reveal himself through Oyer, or he can reveal himself through Malchus, meaning through a Helam, and through Malchus. And Malchus carries that Hisnaasus Atzmi, but it reveals it to some extent. So that revelation is subject to a concealment of the Parsa, so it can be moved along. In a way, in other words, it's another way of saying how the Atzmi manifests in Gili, and therefore when there's Gili, there's Helam. That seems to be first Yesh Shleimer. The second Yesh Shleimer, Shamaylim ala Keiches, that Malchus is covering up on the faculties. We know that, because Malchus does not tell you about the Chesed Gvura of the Melech, like we discussed a few pages back. So it conceals the Keiches. Okay. So it's concealing the Keiches. So I think the second answer is what I said before, which is that the Helam of Malchus is not referring to the Atzmi of it. It's referring to the capacity to conceal the Giluyim. So it's not in a state of Gili, it's like almost the opposite answer. It's in the state of Helam of the Giluyim. Like the Baal Mechin, Gadlus, that has the power. Yeah. I think the second answer is something like this. Since Malchus is in a state of Havdalah, it's removed, as opposed to the other faculties that are revealed, Kiruv, Malchus is Zichur Kan Havdalah. So that's why it has the power to conceal all those Giluyim, like the teacher concealing all his brilliance, so you can create or bring the idea to the student. That's what I think he's saying in the second part. So how does that answer the question? that Hisnaasus Atzmi, that's where it's rooted. But the Helam that we're talking about is not a Helam Be'etzem, it's a Helam of concealing, like the moon that conceals the higher Giluyim of the sun and so on. So therefore, it's not a contradiction to the Likutei Torah, because Likutei Torah is talking this Hisnaasus Atzmi. And here we're not talking about that. We're talking about the concealment. How Malchus conceals the higher levels of Ishtalshlus. That's what it seems to me is the second answer. But I need to think about it some more, because how does it relate to Hisnaasus Atzmi, and what does he mean? Shemis'alman by etzem. Okay, I think he means with that Malchus causes all the faculties to recede back into their source, like the Tzimtzum. The power of the Tzimtzum has the power to cause everything, the area itself, to recede. And that's the concealment. And that's not a contradiction to the Hisnaasus Atzmi. Hisnaasus Ba'atzmi, that is the quality of Hisnaasus Atzmi. Now, I don't know if that made sense to you, but I think it made some sense to me. I just need more words to explain it. But you know what? Let me stop here. We have another class tomorrow. We'll continue, but let me hear from you. Let's hear questions, comments, anything. If you're completely confused, it's also
not
fine.
completely confused, but confused. The first thing that you said, the first thing you explained it, that makes a little more sense now. That what you said, why is it Shayach? Because his galus, the Hisnaasus Atzmoi Kanal.
Right. Okay, so is it,
that's also not very clear, but that makes maybe a little bit clarity. The second thing, I don't understand. The dogma
okay, listen, I look, if your question that you're going to ask me is that you don't understand it yet, I'm telling you that I'm also developing it right now. So I don't fully understand it yet either. I think I have a sense of what he's saying. I don't have the full words. I need a few examples to really explain it, but I'm going to develop it. I just, we read it. This is not the first time. There's nothing wrong with learning something and not understanding it immediately, and takes time. So that's one of the reasons I learned it this way. This is perfectly fine. When you learn something and you're confused or you're not cleared, don't beat yourself up. It's a perfectly normal process. That's how we learn new things, because they're like a deeper concept. So we'll get there. I'm confident that we'll understand it. It's just that it's brief and very condensed. But I have an example for the first answer. Second answer, I need to think about more. But let me just hear from everyone else. If anybody else wants
one more thing
to add anything. Anybody else wants to add
your
anything?
Information. Could I say one more thing?
Sure.
One more thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Before, when you spoke about that, the Atzmus is above Helem, because it's above. Are you having a marshal for that? Something which is above that you cannot say even Helem.
Yeah. The mashal I often give is when you talk about, let's say, etzem hanefesh. So right now, if I asked you, what is your left leg doing? So you think about your left leg and you say, okay, it's resting on the ground, it's shaking, whatever it is. The left leg was there before you felt it or conscious of it. In other words, consciousness itself is already a state, a lower state than etzem. The mere fact that you're alive, the mere fact that you exist, is not subject to Gilead and Helem. It's there, whether you know it or you don't know it. Consciousness, there, either you're more revealed, less revealed. Someone's going to ask you, how intelligent are you or another person? So you could say, I can talk to you about Giluyim. They're intelligent, let's say, from 1 to 100, a 90. If they work harder, your guy to mitzvah, they'll be 95. 100, maybe even 100. But if someone were to ask you, what are they be'etzem, the etzem koyach hachachme inside of you, your answer would be, it's not subject to Gilead and Helem, because it's an Atzmi. In other words, there are states of being that are not about how revealed or not revealed they are. They just are. Like we say, etzem bilti mispashet, etzem bilti misgala. What does that mean? Because Gilui and Etzem, it's not just there's a Gilui and there's an Etzem, two different states. Etzem is not subject to Giluyim altogether. So when you say, for example, that when you see a Jew, that a Kal Shebekalim, and there's nothing revealed in any way about his Yiddishkeit and his connection to God, you say, but his Etzem and Neshama, like in Perik Yud Ches Yutes and Tanya, is connected. Will you ever see it? Maybe with time of Mesiras Nefesh or whatever. But the point is, it's not about Gili. He is this way, whether it's revealed or not revealed. So when you apply this to Atzmus, the Etzem Inyan of Gilui is a Chiddush. The Eibishter created Gilui. Remember, we spoke about Oyer. It's not just like in the case of a human being, you can choose to reveal yourself, not. The whole concept of Gilui and awareness and consciousness is not existent in Atzmus until he chooses to be so. He's not limited. He could reveal, but he doesn't need to reveal. So the concept, as soon as you say that something could be revealed or concealed, so in other words, in relationship, for example, a healthy parent and a child can never be disconnected. There's an etzem atzmis between a parent and a child. It has nothing to do with giluyim. They may not even speak to each other. They may not see each other, but there's an ava atzmis. And obviously, you want it to be revealed. You want them to have a relationship. But the ava atzmis is not subject to gili and helam. You can have two people that speak to each other, and be gili, they love each other, but they don't have ava atzmis necessarily. So in other words, atzmis is just a fundamental connection that's not about gili and helam. The ultimate kavanah is that etzem should be begili, yes. But the point is, etzem is by definition not a gili. So in that sense, it's above helam and gili. Now, to go back to the first answer, I'll use that to explain it. So the first answer is saying, but the Eibishter wanted to be Megala his etzem in some way. Not the whole etzem, but at some way. So remember when we learned about Yesh HaMiti and Yesh HaNivra. The Yesh HaNivra reveals the Yesh HaMiti. Why? Because as he says in Geras HaKedesh, Chof 20, that Hu Levade Bekeche V'Yecholte Livra Yesh Ma'ayin Ve'efes HaMuchlit She'ein Lo Ila V'Siba Shekod Maloi. Why? Because he's Mutziyusim Atzmus is. She'ein Lo Ila V'Siba Acheres Shekod Maloi Chas V'Shalom. Only something that has no source, that is so-called generated from itself, can create something that should not feel that it has a source. That's a koyach atzmi. Oyer can never do that, because Oyer by definition is gilui, and Oyer by definition is connected to its source. Oyer never says I have no source. On the contrary, every Oyer will tell you I'm 24/7 connected to my source. The sunlight can never say I'm a separate entity, because there's no sun, there's no sunlight. Only atzmus, that's mitzusim atzmus, can create a yesh. This is an example from Malchus, by the way. If you look in Geras HaKedesh, he says Malchus is therefore, in that sense, in the spheres, Malchus is like the yesh compared to the oyer of the 9 higher spheres. Because Malchus, that's why it's eretz, it's earth, and that's why the kayach hatzameach, the ability to create, is in earth, like the ability for a mother to be the womb that carries a child. So in other words, the power of creation is embedded in Malchus. Obviously, Malchus is not Atzmus, but it's an expression of Atzmus. That means a Gilu of Hisnaasus Atzmi. Oyer is a Gilu of Gilu that is not Hisnaasus Atzmi. It's a Gilu of Elikus. It reveals godliness, but primarily how God expresses himself through Chachma, Bina, in some manifestation. That's the mile of Oyer, that it's Gilu. The mile of Malchus is that it's mushrish and rooted in the etzem. But but in some way, the Malchus reveals the Hisnaasus Atzmi, but at the same time, it's still fundamentally a state of Helam, because even Hisnaasus Atzmi is a state of Helam. The question is, how does the Parsa come into play? Which seems like a Helam outside of the etzem. So that's what he's saying, that once Malchus is some form of Gili, Atzmus itself is completely no Gili. Since Malchus has some form of Gili, you could also then say there's some form of Helam. Or to put it in different words, Moshe Rabbeinu was a melech, Vahi b'shur melech. David HaMelech was a melech. And yet they had opposition. Avshalom rebelled against David HaMelech. Moshe Rabbeinu rebelled. Now, against Atzmus, you can't rebel. because Atzmus is not subject, he's not interacting with you. However, Moshe was a manifestation of Malchus Shal Kadosh Baruch Hu, as a human being, like a melech carries the power of Hashem's Malchus. That's why we make a bracha, and so on. So there's already Gili, so there can be a hell. Atzmus, you can't fight against Atzmus because Atzmus is altogether not manifest in any state of Gili. Atzmus is fundamentally higher than the whole thing. So in other words, just as an example, that when once already there's some Gili, it's still a Gili of a Havdalah Dika Gili, because a melech is not your friend, and he's not a Gili in the Kiruv, but it is a Gili. You have a Moshe Rabbeinu standing in front of you. So in that sense, so if you want to put it in other terms, I'll just share, I know we're a little over time, but let me just share this. There was a Sikha that Rebbe spoke about, I think it was Tafshin Chav Ches. Very strong, very, very powerful Sikha. And the Rebbe spoke about the Meraglim. And the Rebbe said that everyone is connected to Moshe Rabbeinu of the generation, the Neshama Klolos. And that's Atzmizdik thing. You can't change that. However, if a person disconnects himself from his Mashaleach, so then, so to speak, that connection is also not there. It's like Ein Saneger, Ein Kateger, Nasa Saneger. It's like on Yom Kippur, it's Tzuma Shel Yom HaChaper, the very day. But if you go and try to use that itself and say, I'll do an Aveda because of that, like Echtev Ashuv, then you disconnect yourself. So the Rebbe was saying, basically, the Hisnaasus that you have is critical. And if a person, God forbid, says, I'm not connected to Moshe Rabbeinu, then they themselves are essentially dooming themselves from the connection. That was essentially the inyan. When they prepared the Sikha for editing, you won't believe what the Rebbe wrote. The Rebbe came to this section, and he said, Hepech betachlis, mufrach betachlis, to say such a thing. You cannot say such a thing. And he went further. He said, burn the pages that this was written on. He wanted to completely obliterate this concept. So, of course, the people who were around at the time said, so why did the Rebbe say that? I mean, would the Rebbe change his mind? I mean, it's such a fundamental thing. The Rebbe says to burn the very pages that wrote such words is so not possible. The Rebbe said, I think it's Hepech Chassidus and Hepech everything. So I think you can explain it this way. Because the fact is, just because a child rebels against their father doesn't mean the Ava Atzmi ever disappears. That's what Moshe accomplished with Yom Kippur. That even though they built a Chet Egel, Mamish Aveda Zorah, the second commandment, Lo Yeh Lecha Elokim Acher. So Hashem was saying to Moshe, what do you want from me? They threw me away. I didn't reject them. And Moshe said, no, but the Ava Atzmi between you two will never disappear. It doesn't matter what they did. Of course they are accountable and they deserve whatever they deserve. But to say that there's no more connection, I should start a new nation? No. So the Rebbe was saying, why is it mufrach? Because the Neshama Klolos is connected to everyone, even if someone, like he says in Pedig Beis and Tanya, even if they rebel against their own connection. You see this all the time. That when a person does an Aveda and disconnects from God, doesn't mean you're fundamentally disconnected. In Giluyim, you're disconnected, but not Be'etzem. So why did the Rebbe say it? I was just thinking about it now as we're learning this, because in the Giluy Ha'etzem of the Hisnaasus, you can say that once you, so to speak, rebel against the connection that you have to your Rebbe, to Moshe, so in the Giluy, there's an element that you've disconnected. But once they wrote it down and it came across as that fundamentally is disconnected, also on the Etzem level, that absolutely not. And the Rebbe didn't want to leave any room for that Havamin. So you could see the Havamina makes sense if you talk about Giluyim. Now you can ask, why didn't the Rebbe
Unbelievable.
One second. Why didn't the Rebbe qualify this itself? Because once you connect the Etzem Hisnaasus, the Rebbe didn't want to leave room that in Giluyim there could be some type of compromise. What were you saying? Sorry, Shem.
I said that this is just amazing. This is what the Rebbe is.
Exactly.
When he cried about Yeroboam and Miriam was Bilgo, and about the Meraglim also. I remember the Rebbe spoke about the Meraglim that Elam Chelek, but they have a higher than Chelek.
Right.
No disconnection.
Correct. Now, so the point that I'm saying, I think it helps understand this first answer at least. The second answer, I need to think about more. But does anybody else want to weigh in since we're on this heavy topic?
So is the parsa the Helam that is created by the Hisnaasus Atzmi?
You have to speak. Tell me that question in English. Because I'm not sure what you mean by it. Hello? Hello? Yitzchak?
I'm sorry, I put myself on mute. The parsa.
I said, I'm not sure what you mean by it. I'm saying, say that question in plain English.
I'm trying to. Can you hear me?
No, we didn't hear you. Now I hear you.
Oh. The Helam, sorry, the parsa is a separation that before we're trying to understand how there can be, I guess, how can Atzilus reveal itself in Gan Eden? Was one of the questions, but in general, the parsa is a separation between in a Seder Hisnaasus between different sort of emanations of Elokus between the worlds. So, and we were trying to understand what is the nature of this parsa. How can something that's in Atzilus be manifested in, I guess, below? And I'm sorry, I'm not finding the right English words, but in any case, we're trying to understand the nature of the parsa. So is it the parsa, the separation, the divider, now putting it back in English, a filter, whatever, between Kodesh Kadoshim and Kodesh, is it that what that is, the constitution of that parsa is essentially the Helam, the separation, the absence of some degree of Elokus that is caused by the Hisnaasus Atzmi. That's by the
what do you mean by Hisnaasus Atzmi, if I may ask?
Well, this notion of Elokus that is separate from that which is beneath it, that which is created from it, below it, just because that which creates a Malchus is above it by its own essence. So just because a king by his nature has to be merumam, he has to be elevated above stam, because that's the nature of Malchus. And so that separation, that essential need of Malchus to be above that which it creates, necessarily implies a helam, a lack of minor, of course, a small degree, a lesser amount of Elokus that causes a separation. So the parsa is not something itself, it exists, but it's really an effect of this elevation of godliness that is Malchus, that is giving rise to the creation. So that's what I understand.
Well, on line 5, I would just read what it says inside. On line 5 of page 1217, the Rebbe Rashab says like this: V'yadua, and it's known, the Hisnaasus zeu gufo aidei Hisnaasus de b'chinas Malchus. That the Hisnaasus, the concealment, that itself is through Malchus's exalted or transcendent state. Because someone who's in an exalted state is removed and concealed from the lower levels. So therefore, the Hisnaasus of the parsa comes from that element of Hisnaasus of Malchus. So he states that explicitly. Yes, correct. I gave the example of a teacher who, when he wants to give an example, which is the parsa, requires a certain deeper dimension where he's able to remove himself from the very idea itself. So he can then give an example which is in a diminished state, but also going to help the student apply and understand the idea. So that's what it says here explicitly. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Last class we left with a little cliffhanger. What is this thing called the parsa? But we've now just elaborated more upon that, what he said there in the line you just read, to some extent.
Yeah, but I spoke earlier that the parsa, the Chassidus gives the example for a parsa of a moshel, of an example from another entity to explain an original idea. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions or comments? So we will review this again Try to go through it again with a second answer, especially, which I think I understand, but I want to explain it better. And we'll stop here. So we're stopping at the end of the parentheses. We read a few lines afterwards before, but basically page 1217 around